When you think about government overreach, you might imagine surveillance programs or wartime restrictions. But in 1933, the United States government pulled off one of the most audacious economic maneuvers in American history. They didn't just raise taxes or print more money, they banned gold. They literally made it illegal for American citizens to own the one asset that had backed their currency for over a century. And the reason they did it reveals everything about how governments manipulate money when they're desperate. This wasn't some abstract policy debate happening in Washington boardrooms. This was the federal government walking into your home and demanding you hand over your wedding ring, your grandfather's coins, your life savings stored in precious metal. They offered you paper dollars in return and told you to trust them. Most Americans complied. Those who didn't became criminals overnight. What makes this story so chilling is that it worked. The gold confiscation of 1933 wasn't just theft disguised as policy. It was the foundation for an economic system that still controls your wealth today. And if you don't understand how it happened, you're missing the blueprint for every financial crisis that followed. Let's set the stage. By 1933, America was drowning in the Great Depression. Banks were collapsing daily. Unemployment had reached 25%. Families were losing their homes, their farms, their hope. President Franklin Roosevelt had just taken office, promising a new deal to save the nation. But behind the speeches and public works programs was a financial system on the verge of total collapse. The problem wasn't just economic, it was monetary. Since 1879, the United States had operated on the gold standard. Every dollar in circulation was backed by gold held in government vaults. Citizens could walk into any bank and exchange their paper money for actual gold coins. This system had one crucial feature that terrified politicians. It limited how much money the government could print. Under the gold standard, if you wanted to issue more dollars, you needed more gold to back them. This created a natural brake on government spending and monetary expansion. Politicians couldn't just print their way out of problems. They couldn't inflate away debts or fund massive programs without the gold reserves to support them. For ordinary Americans, this meant their money held real value. A dollar today would be worth roughly the same tomorrow because it represented a fixed amount of gold. But Roosevelt and his advisors saw the gold standard differently. They saw it as a straitjacket preventing them from taking the dramatic actions they believed were necessary to end the Depression. They wanted to devalue the dollar to make American exports cheaper and boost domestic prices. They wanted to print money to fund government programs and stimulate the economy. The gold standard made all of this impossible. So they decided to break it, but they couldn't simply abandon gold while Americans still owned it. As long as citizens could demand gold for their dollars, the government's ability to manipulate the currency remained limited. People would lose confidence in paper money and demand the real thing. The only solution was to get the gold out of private hands entirely. On April 5, 1933, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102. The order was breathtaking in its scope and audacity. It required all American citizens to turn in their gold coins, gold bullion, and gold certificates to the Federal Reserve by May 1, 1933. The penalty for non-compliance was a $10,000 fine and 10 years in prison. In today's money, that fine would be worth over $200,000. The order wasn't a request. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command backed by the full force of federal law enforcement. Americans had less than a month to surrender gold they had accumulated over lifetimes. Wedding rings and small amounts of jewelry were exempt, but everything else had to go. The government offered $35 per ounce in exchange, the official price at the time. Most Americans complied. They lined up at banks and Federal Reserve offices carrying bags and boxes of gold coins their grandparents had saved. They watched tellers weigh their treasure and hand them paper money in return. Many did it reluctantly, but they did it. The alternative was becoming a federal criminal. But here's where the manipulation gets truly sinister. Once the government had collected most of America's gold, Roosevelt immediately changed the rules. In January 1934, he signed the Gold Reserve Act, which raised the official price of gold from $35 to $35 per ounce. Wait, that's not right. He raised it from $20.67 per ounce to $35 per ounce. Think about what this means. The government forced Americans to sell their gold at the old price, then immediately increased the official value by almost 70%. Citizens who had surrendered their gold at $20.67 per ounce watched the government revalue that same gold at $35 per ounce just months later. It was the largest wealth transfer from private citizens to the federal government in American history. The economic impact was immediate and profound. By devaluing the dollar against gold, Roosevelt made American goods cheaper on international markets. Exports began to recover, but the cost was paid by every American who had trusted their government and surrendered their gold at the artificially low price. The psychological impact was even more significant. For the first time in American history, citizens learned that their government could and would confiscate private property when it suited political purposes. The idea that gold ownership was a fundamental right, something that couldn't be touched by government decree, died in 1933. Americans discovered that no asset, no matter how traditional or seemingly secure, was beyond the reach of federal power. The confiscation itself was a masterclass in government propaganda. Roosevelt didn't present it as theft or manipulation. He framed it as patriotic duty during a national emergency. The official announcement called it a temporary measure to stabilize the currency and restore confidence in American banks. Citizens were told they were helping their country recover from the worst economic crisis in its history. Radio broadcasts and newspaper editorials praised Americans who voluntarily surrendered their gold as heroes putting nation above personal interest. Those who hesitated were portrayed as hoarders and speculators undermining recovery efforts. The messaging was brilliant and ruthless. It transformed an act of confiscation into an act of citizenship, but not everyone bought the narrative. Some Americans recognized what was really happening and refused to comply. They buried gold in their backyards, hid coins in walls, or smuggled bullion to safety deposit boxes in other countries. These weren't criminals or tax evaders. They were ordinary citizens who understood that surrendering their gold meant surrendering their financial independence. The government's response was swift and merciless. Federal agents conducted raids on suspected hoarders. They searched homes, businesses, and safety deposit boxes. They offered rewards to informants who reported neighbors hiding gold. The Treasury Department created a special unit dedicated to hunting down non-compliant citizens and seizing their assets. One of the most notorious cases involved Frederick Barber Campbell, a lawyer who challenged the constitutionality of the gold confiscation in court. Campbell argued that the government hazed private property without due process and no authority to said that the executive order violated the Fifth Amendment. His legal challenge made him a target. Federal agents raided his office, seized his gold, and prosecuted him for non-compliance. Campbell's case revealed the true nature of the government's position. They weren't interested in legal challenges or constitutional debates. They were determined to eliminate gold ownership regardless of the law. Campbell lost his case, lost his gold, and served resistance. The International Elst as a warning to anyone considering community watched America's gold confiscation with a mixture of fascination and horror. European governments had experimented with currency manipulation before, but nothing on this scale had ever been attempted by a major democracy. Some praised Roosevelt's boldness in taking decisive action during a crisis. Others recognized it as a dangerous precedent that could spread to their own nations. What made the American experiment particularly alarming was how efficiently it worked. Within months, the government had successfully removed most gold from private circulation. The Federal Reserve's vaults filled with confiscated bullion, while citizens held increasingly worthless paper promises. Other countries began studying the American model, wondering if they too could escape the constraints of sound money through confiscation and devaluation. The economic effects rippled outward in ways Roosevelt's advisors hadn't fully anticipated. While American exports became more competitive, the dollar's devaluation created inflation at home. Prices for imported goods rose sharply. Families found themselves paying more for everything, from coffee to clothing. The promised economic recovery came at the cost of reduced purchasing power for ordinary Americans. More insidious was the psychological shift in how Americans viewed money itself. Before 1933, gold had been money for thousands of years. It was tangible, finite, and independent of political decisions. After the confiscation, money became whatever the government said it was. Paper dollars weren't backed by gold anymore. They were backed by faith in government promises. This transformation didn't happen overnight. Many Americans continued to think of money in terms of gold value for years after the confiscation. But gradually, a new generation grew up never knowing a world where citizens could own monetary gold. They accepted paper currency as natural and normal. They trusted banks and government institutions because they had no memory of alternatives. The long-term consequences became clear only decades later. Once Americans accepted that government could confiscate gold during emergencies, they accepted the principle that no asset was truly private. The precedent established in 1933 would be invoked repeatedly throughout the 20th century. Property rights, privacy rights, and financial independence all became subordinate to government claims of necessity. By 1971, President Nixon would complete what Roosevelt started. He severed the last link between the dollar and gold, ending the international gold standard and creating the fully fiat monetary system we live under today. But Nixon's decision was only possible because Americans had already been conditioned to accept government control over money. The gold confiscation of 1933 had prepared the ground for every monetary manipulation that followed. The most chilling aspect of this story isn't what happened to gold. It's what happened to the American mindset. A population that once jealously guarded its monetary independence learned to trust government promises over tangible assets. Citizens who had viewed gold ownership as a fundamental right accepted its prohibition as temporary necessity. That temporary necessity became permanent policy, and permanent policy became accepted reality. The gold confiscation of 1933 wasn't just a Depression-era policy. It was the moment America learned that government promises matter more than private property, that emergency powers never expire, and that citizens will surrender their wealth if you frame it as patriotic duty. Roosevelt didn't just ban gold. He rewired the American mind to accept government control over money itself. Every financial crisis since then has followed the same playbook. Declare an emergency, demand sacrifice from ordinary people, promise temporary measures, then make them permanent. The 2008 bailouts, the 2020 money printing, the endless expansion of government debt, all of it flows from the precedent set in 1933. When Americans accepted that gold could be confiscated for the greater good, they accepted that no asset is truly theirs. History doesn't repeat, but it echoes. And the echo of 1933 still reverberates through every dollar in your wallet, every promise from Washington, every crisis that demands your sacrifice. The question isn't whether it could happen again. The question is whether you'll recognize it when it does. If this opened your eyes to how power really works, hit subscribe. History has the warnings. I'll show you where to look.